Having the wrong settings puts you at an instant disadvantage, and once you know what to change and why, it'll only take 5 minutes to optimize for instant results. In this video, I'll be going over the best in-game settings that pros use for competitive Valorant. I'll talk about exactly what settings to put on and why, along with a bunch of other important settings that will increase your FPS, decrease your input lag, and give you an edge in Valorant. And real quick, if you don't know who I am, I'm Misfit and I used to be a pro Valorant player for 3 different European rosters, and now I'm a full-time coach and I make content all about improving at Valorant. Let's get into the video. Starting with general settings, and there's a few settings in here guys that you absolutely need to have right. But the first thing you need to do is pick an enemy highlight colour. I personally prefer yellow. I find it stands out across most maps, whereas red outlines rarely blend in certain parts of maps, especially on Ascent. I also struggle to react to more common agents like Phoenix or Raze when I have red outlines on. Most of the top pros I see play on yellow, but there's plenty of tier 1 players that play on red, and Demon 1 plays on purple, so end of the day guys, experiment with what works best for you. Next up is mouse settings, and this is so important to have nailed down. I used to change my sense 24/7, so I've tried all of the different ranges from high, medium and low sense. In my experience, it's so much easier to play on a low sense in Val in general. It's easier to keep your aim stable, but it also forces you to peek properly. You see, when you're zooming around deathmatch on a high sense, you can get away with suboptimal peaks and bad crosshair placement just by out aiming people. But try this with a lower sense and you're going to have a harder time flicking, so you're definitely going to get punished. Therefore, lower sense can actually lead you to learning better fundamentals with your peaks and movement. I've gone for 0.3. Whatever you choose, it's up to you. I'd recommend a sense between 0.2 to 0.4 at 800 DPI. I do know a lot of players are going with 1600 DPI lately. I find it a bit too fast in Windows compared to my in-game sense, and I prefer it to be a bit more consistent across the board. Moving on, keep your scoped sense on your ADS sensor 1. This keeps your sense consistent across the board. Invert mouse on off, obviously, and raw input buffer on. If you have raw input buffer on, the game will choose to read your mouse inputs directly from the mouse instead of your operating system like Windows. This is going to reduce your input lag, and this way you can avoid any settings that may be affecting your mouse in Windows, such as mouse acceleration. Happy days. Next section is a big issue for so many of my students, the minimap. One of the most underrated tools you have at your disposal, and unfortunately guys, teammates in ranked have a bad habit of not communicating their information, so it's absolutely essential you have these settings optimized so that you can see all of the map wherever you're positioned. For that reason, I like to keep player centered on off, and this way I can have a way bigger map, and it makes it very easy to see exactly what my teammates are doing, where they're looking and what info they have. This allows me to max out my minimap size at 1.2 and see the map way more clearly. You can go for a range of 0.9 to 0.93 on minimap zoom if you have keep player centered off, but it's entirely up to you. If you don't like the orientation with keep player centered off, you can just put it on, but what you're going to have to do is zoom your map out to about 0.6, and for me, it's just way too small. I need to react in quick situations in Valorant, so I like to keep it on off. It should go without saying that minimap vision cones should be on. I've actually coached students that have these off, but without these on, you'll have no idea what your team are watching. You can even see if areas are smoked when the vision cones are blocked on the minimap. I have show region map names on always, that way I can see the callouts when I open the map, and I like to hide my name to remain anonymous. For first person handedness, I go with it on right. I've always had my gun on the right, so I just feel comfortable with that. Experiment with both and pick whichever one you like. I'd recommend playing with always show inventory on. So many times with the chaos in Valorant, you run over a gun and you don't even notice. Everything else here should be off. For mature content, I put that on, and then show corpses and blood off. Blood on or off is pretty much personal preference, but a lot of streamed LANs force you to turn blood off. So if you're trying to go pro, you'll definitely want to keep this off. Having blood on can give you tells behind some boxes if you spam people in the head. However, in my opinion, I actually think in multi-kill situations, if you headshot the first enemy, the blood shoots everywhere. It's super distracting and it can cause you to whiff. For corpses, you should definitely have these off. If you don't, they can get in the way of enemies' peaks in certain spots. However, if you're playing Sage, having corpses on can help in the confusion of trying to res someone. Instability indicators on, and network buffering minimum. 99% of you should always choose minimum, otherwise you will get input lag. Now, I play with bullet tracers on, but I know a lot of people play with these off. They can be distracting, and honestly guys, after this video I might experiment with playing with them off. I have spectator count on. I don't really mind when people are watching me clutch, it doesn't really bother me, but if you struggle with confidence or get nervous in clutches, it might be a good idea to turn this off. Everything else is pretty standard, and that's it for this section. So next up is keybinds, and these ones are so much more important than you might think. Now, I don't really mind which keybinds you use, and I've seen some crazy ones in my time, but I do have a few rules. But before we get into the rules, if you found any of these tips valuable so far, hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks a lot guys. I have ability 2 and 3 on my mouse buttons. Why? Well, if I play Reyna, Chamber or Jet, I want to be in full control of my movement whenever I use their escape. It's even more important on Jet. You can use E for Jet's dash, but if you ever want to dash to the right, you're going to have to press E with your middle finger and D with your pointer finger, which is just crazy difficult. Same goes for your voice bind. If you can't press your voice bind with your thumb or left pinky, you can't move while comming. Obviously that's not good. You can use mouse buttons for voice, I know some pros do, but I really hate adding the extra tension to the mouse when shooting and comming, so I tend to keep it onto a thumb or a pinky key. Anyways, back to the keybinds. Everything else is pretty standard. I have default movement mode on run, toggle walk on off obviously, and I do have mouse wheel up bound to jump. I use mouse wheel up to jump. Most pros seem to use mouse wheel down from what I've seen, but I've always used up, so I'm just used to it. I definitely recommend using mouse wheel though. It's just way easier to move like that, but in this game you can get away with jumping with spacebar, so it's not really such an issue. Everything else is standard. Onto equipment. Starting with scoped weapons. Trying to use a scoped weapon is so bad if you have sniper rifle aim on toggle. There's so many situations where you need to leave the scope immediately, which is why most pros use sniper rifle aim on hold. It just feels way quicker. Doing this means I have to bind a zoom level to double zoom with the op, so I just choose to use the opposite of my jump bind, which is mouse wheel down. You could use your middle mouse button as well, but whatever's comfortable to you. I use toggle for ADS, which some people might find weird, but in Valorant you should only be using ADS at long range to increase your first bullet accuracy, and in these situations you don't want extra tension having to hold down the right click. All that's going to do is mess up your aim. Everything else is standard. Unbind cycled next and previous weapons. If you use these to switch guns, it's a really inefficient habit, and it's definitely worth unbinding them and getting used to the number keys. I have auto equip prioritize on most recently equipped. If you have it on strongest, then when you're planting the bomb with an op, and you have your pistol selected, after planting, it's going to pull out the strongest weapon, which is the op. But there's so many scenarios where someone might be rushing you after a plant and you're going to instantly want your pistol. And I find if you have it on strongest, it's just going to troll you more often than not. The same thing happens if you're a jet dashing with a sheriff, but you have an op in your back pocket. Same thing with don't auto equip melee. There's going to be times where I'm taking an orb and I just want to reselect my melee without having to think about it, so I uncheck that box too. Everything else is pretty standard here. And moving on to communication, not much to say for this one. I have ping on Z. I find it's perfect for me. We've talked about the push to talk key. I go with V here so that I can move. I can press D with my index finger and V with my thumb, so I can talk and move at the same time. And the only thing to say about interface is make sure you're actually using this bind. This bind is so underpowered. Lots of people don't even use it. So again, it's open map to hold. And what you can use this for is pinging the bomb through smokes. You can even ping areas to spam with smokes, and in this game it's so important. For crosshairs, I prefer 1420, the one that El Diablo made famous, but a lot of pros use the small white dot like this one as well. I'll link all three in the description. I find with a dot crosshair it can be really easy to lose track of, and for me I think the precision goes up, but I have a worse crosshair placement, and that accounts for like 90% of aiming in Valorant. With a cross, it just seems way more natural to line it up and gauge distance on a wall. For the sniper scope, I like to use a white dot. I turn the center dot thickness on 0.8 and the center dot opacity on 1. Alright then, for video settings, these settings might be the most important settings so far, and I just know so many of you will have these wrong because almost every student I see plays on windowed full screen so that they can alt tab faster. Trust me guys, you will get way more input lag by doing this. Not only that, but you shouldn't be perma-alt tabbing in ranked anyway, or you're not going to pick up on reads or tendencies. So if there's nothing else you do in this settings guide, please play on full screen. It's so much better. You should go without saying that you should pick your maximum hertz. If you don't have above a 60 hertz monitor, I'd definitely recommend investing in at least 144 hertz. And I play at max res, but stretched is also goated, so it's fine. I'd personally recommend staying away from true stretched. I'd be worried about it giving input lag or a false ban. Everything else is pretty standard here. I don't limit my FPS. For Nvidia Reflex low latency, I'd recommend looking into it. When I did, I found out that for a 2070 Supers and above, you should use on plus boost. So that's any 3 series, any 4 series cards. Anything below that, you should use on. I have a 3080, so I have it on plus boost. For graphics, I optimize for maximum FPS. I put multi-threaded rendering on, everything else on low and off, and I like to have my anti-aliasing and filtering on 4x. A few different combinations I've seen could be none and 1, which gives you jagged edges. 4x or 4x 8x seem to be the most common ones. I know Scream used to play on 2x and that's okay too. I'd recommend going in the range and trying out which one you prefer. Bloom is optional. If you have it on, the enemy's server's recons are going to glow red, which is a huge advantage, especially for newer players, but it's also going to change how the enemies look, and they look super shiny and I kind of hate it, so I turn it off. Cast shadows, make sure you have this off. A lot of people think by turning this off you're not going to be able to see enemy shadows, but it's actually just for the detailing on the weapons, so it's just an FPS loss. For stats, everything's on default. You could obviously turn your FPS on if you want to see that. Any input latency that you're concerned about, you could turn on network RTT and processing delays, incoming packet loss. But one thing you should definitely have switched on, graph only, is your shooting error. Shooting error is going to allow you to see when you're trolling. What it's going to show you is when you're moving while firing, there's going to be a graph that appears in blue, and when you actually counter strafe or stop properly, the graph's going to be in orange. So it's really useful for improving your movement and your dead zoning. As for audio, I just turn off the menu and lobby music volume. Everything else is obviously personal preference, you're going to have to experiment for this yourself, but one thing I would definitely do recommend is enabling HRTF. For me, I find it so much easier to hear where the enemy's footsteps are coming from, and it basically provides better 3D sound, so what's not to love? For voice chat, make sure you're using the correct input and output settings, so for me it's just my HyperX Cloud 2 wireless, and then I have all the voiceovers on because it just gives you audible info of what's happening. So now you're going to have all the settings optimized just like pros do, and if you found any of this valuable, hit subscribe guys for more future videos like this, and for your next video, if you're struggling with a warm-up, make sure you watch this video in the top left.